Welcome to Jackie's Craft Table. Hello everyone and welcome. I'm going to be creating cards with MFT's new card kit for June. It's called Painted Prints. I'm going to show you what's inside the kit. There's also a few extra items that I picked up when I ordered their kit. I really love MFT's pattern paper. This one is called Watercolor Wash. I thought it would go well with the kit. This second one is called Dots and Stripes Confection. I love striped paper. I have their black and white striped paper pad, and I use that a lot. I really loved all of these colors, and I thought the two pads would go well together. This is their hybrid ink cube set, and it's set number 16. I liked it because of the two orange colors. I wanted to order enough so that I'd be eligible to get this free with purchase die. This die will coordinate well with this card kit. They included one sheet of heavyweight translucent vellum in their card kit, but I didn't think it was going to be enough, so I did order a pack of that. I don't use vellum in my card crafting, so I was excited to try it out. And now let's see what's in this card kit. This is the first time I've ever purchased an MFT card kit, but this one just looked fabulous. I really love layering stamp sets. When you stamp them out, they look very much like watercolored images. They have lines around them on the packaging to show which stamps go together. And I really love to have coordinating dies. I don't always buy them, but they just make life easier. This stamp set seems to include a sentiment for every occasion, and I loved the font of these. This is the example sheet that they included. They made so many pretty cards with this set. I just love these examples. And onto their lovely cardstock. They included 5 sheets of their smooth white cardstock. And this is heavy duty. You could use that for card bases. Here is the sheet of vellum. They included a pink lemonade, a cotton candy, a razzleberry, sour apple, gumdrop green, peach Bellini. This is Coral Crush and Persimmon, and then their Craft, which I've never tried, and a piece of their Still Gray. I just love all the names of their pretty cardstocks. For card number 1, I cut up a piece of the white cardstock, and I'm going to stamp out the tulips from this Painted Flowers stamp set. I'm going to start with the base layer first. It helps to have a stamp positioner tool like this Mini Misty I'm using. That way you can restamp them for a darker image if you want, but an acrylic block works just fine. It's so easy to layer these. I'm stamping them up with the lightest orange, which is Coral Crush. These stamps haven't been conditioned yet, so they didn't stamp out perfectly, but I kind of liked the distressed look of it, so I didn't stamp them again. Just going to clean off my stamps and move on to the second layer. And for this color, I used Persimmon. As I said before, they're pretty easy to line up, but even if you don't align them perfectly, they turn out really cute because these are more painterly type images. So even if your stamping is a little off, I think they still turn out really darling. These little mini ink cubes were really juicy, so I just had to tap them on the stamps very lightly. These two colors look so cute together. Now I can stamp the third layer of these images, and it's the little green part that connects to the stems. I think you could even skip this third layer if you didn't want to bother with it. But I just wanted to try out all the stamps in this pretty set. And now for the stems, and I like how they have one straight and one curvy. I used the curvy one the most, I think, with all of these cards. And I'm just going to flip that so I can stamp out 2 more of the stems. I'll have all of the ink colors that I'm using and all of the supplies listed over on my blog if you're interested. I pulled out my wire snips to cut apart these dies, and then I can just tape them in place with a little bit of purple tape. I like to tape them down so they don't shift when I run them through my die cutting machine. Sorry, my head gets in the way there. I have to look over it so that I can make sure that there's a white border all the way around the image. These look so darling once they are cut out. I'm using a piece of the vellum to cut out the vase. I'm also using an oval frame die, and I cut that out once with the persimmon cardstock and 2 more times with the white because I want it to have a little bit of dimension. I'm gluing some striped paper right onto my card base, and then I'm going to glue all of these frames together. I'm just using some liquid adhesive to put these together. And now I can put the orange one on top. I'm just trying to get them so that they align perfectly. I like the bright pop of orange that gives. Because blue is a complementary color to orange, I wanted to use a little bit of blue on this card panel. So that's some color cardstock from my own stash. I'm using just a little drop of glue to adhere this first stem. You can see the glue behind the vellum, so I'm being very careful not to use too much glue on this. And then for the other stems, I'm just connecting them to the first stem, if that makes sense. And I like the effect of these stems behind this vellum because it makes it look kind of like a frosted vase. And it's fun to see the little stems through it. Now I can adhere this down onto my card panel with a little more glue. And as I said before, I'm being careful so it doesn't show through the vellum. I'm gluing these flowers just flat onto this blue cardstock. It would look cute with some more dimension if you wanted to pop them up with some foam dots. But the frame has enough dimension, I think, for this card. And that just looks so cute. I did add 2 little dots there to keep my vase in place, but it's going to be covered with my sentiment. I didn't want my sentiment to cover up this vase completely because I liked being able to see the stems through this vellum. I thought that was really fun. For a last touch, I'm just adding a few coordinating sequins from my stash, and that finishes my first card. Card number 2 is going to be quick and easy and really fun. I've pulled out the base layer stamps for all of my tulips. I'm inking them up with Versamark ink, and I'm going to emboss them with white embossing powder. Before I heat set this, I am going to emboss the stems as well, or stamp them out, I should say, with more Versamark ink. And I'm just going right over the embossing powder that's there, and then I can pour on a little bit more over the stems. Now I can heat emboss them, and I let my heat tool warm up for about a minute before I brought it to the paper. This helps to keep it from warping too badly. Now for the fun part, the Distress Oxide inks. I'm using worn lipstick at the bottom. I want this to be kind of an ombre effect, and I just love how the embossed flowers pop out. At the top of this panel, I'm using Tattered Rose. I love these 2 colors together. I think they look so pretty. I'm buffing off my embossed flowers with a tissue, and this just helps brighten them up again to make them white. For the sentiment, I'm going to stamp that onto a piece of the vellum. It's very slippery, so you have to be kind of careful. And then I'm pouring over clear embossing powder on that. This will just help the sentiment look a little bit darker on the vellum. I find that when you stamp on vellum without embossing it, it looks kind of faded. It was kind of challenging heat embossing this vellum because it wanted to bubble up. I made sure my heat tool, again, was good and hot, and I just moved that around a lot. I didn't keep it in one place for very long. And then I'm just taping it to the back of my card so that you don't see any glue behind this, but you can put little dots of glue if you wanted to behind the sentiment. I'm using some twine to add a little bow under my sentiment. I wrapped that around it a couple of times, and then I can just tie my bow on the side. I thought this added a cute touch as well. I haven't used my ribbon or my twine for a while, so I thought I would pull that out, and then I can just trim off the ends. I'm going to mat this piece with a piece of white cardstock, and then I'm adhering it to a card base. And this is the Peach Bellini. I just loved this color. I'm going to have to get more of this for my stash. And then I looked through my stash and I found these Strawberry Burst sequins, and I'm just going to add a few of them across my panel. The inside's going to be very simple. I'm just going to use a strip of white cardstock and then a strip of the cardstock that I cut off of my panel. The insides of your cards don't have to be elaborate. Just little touches like this just make a lot of difference, I think. Here's another look at card number 2. For card number 3, I'm going to stamp up all 4 of the tulips that came in this set. I'm using my lemon chiffon for my first layer. I will stamp this out twice because I want this to be kind of dark. My color palette for this card is going to be yellow and teal. I think those colors look really pretty together. For my second layer, I'm using a Simon Says stamp ink called Apricot. There are so many little stamps in this set that I try and clean them right away and put them right back onto the clear sheet, just so I don't lose them. I've lost things before. It's a sickening feeling, so I wanted to put them right away. I'm going to stamp up my teal colors now. This first color is called Blue Lagoon, and it's from Gina K. In my collection, I just have a mishmash of colors. And the second color is a MFT pigment ink, and it's called Lavender Fields. I love how these two inks look together. Here they are, all die cut. And then I can just shift my dies over to my yellow flowers, and I'm just using the same tape. I use this purple tape over and over. It's really great. I'm also using a teal colored cardstock from my stash. I believe this is Blue Lagoon as well from Gina K. I'm going to heat emboss the sentiment, so I stamp that with Versamark ink, and I'm pouring over some white embossing powder. I love how that pops off of this blue card panel. And now I can adhere everything together. This kit came with a lot of white cardstock, so I'm using that for my card base. And then I'm putting glue behind this vellum piece just where I know I'm going to be covering them up with the flowers. Some of these flowers I'm adhering onto this card panel without any dimension, just straight onto the vellum. And I'm going to put a layer of those down. And it just does really well to hide the glue behind the vellum. And then my second layer of flowers, I'm going to pop them up with some square foam dots. All of the stems, however, I am just adhering flat onto the card panel. It's just too hard to put little pieces of foam behind them. I'm using my Spectrum Noir glitter pen. It's such a juicy pen that when I opened up the cap, it just sprayed my panel with little droplets, and I thought that was kind of cute, so I just went with it, and I'm adding some more spattering here. That was a very happy mistake because I love the effect of that. And now for a few turquoise sequins, and that completes this card. I'm going to have to remember to use my glitter pen for spatters in the future. I really liked that. I think I had the most fun creating card number 4. I pulled out a piece of watercolor paper, and I'm using my little Distress ink cubes, and I'm just stamping out very messy flowers with these inks. So I stamp up the images, and then I use my spray bottle just to squirt them. This makes the paints bleed together a little bit, and it gives a very nice watercolor effect. It looks kind of like I painted them instead of stamped them. So I'm just kind of turning my panel just to let it bleed a little bit onto the white spaces. And now for the greenery, I'm just stamping up the petals, and I'm using 2 different colors of green ink for this. I believe I'm using Mowed Lawn and Crushed Olive. If you've never tried this technique before, I would highly recommend it. It is so much fun. I wanted my colors to bleed a little bit more into the white spaces, so I'm just spraying it down here with a spray bottle, and then I'm picking that up and just letting the colors move around. It made the background of this panel look yellow, and it was really a cute effect when it was all dry. This is a piece of Arches cold press watercolor paper. This is a nice paper that will take a lot of water. I thought it needed a few more flowers, so I'm just going to stamp it right onto the wet panel. This is a very messy and fun technique. I'm going to use another piece of vellum for the sentiment on this card. I'm having a lot of fun with this vellum, and I heat embossed that with pink embossing powder. To attach it onto my dry panel, I'm just putting little dots of glue behind the sentiment. That way you won't see the glue behind the vellum. I trimmed down this panel a little bit, and I'm going to use the leftover pieces to decorate the inside of my card. This is a piece of the raspberry cardstock, and I made that into my card base. And I really didn't want to waste these pretty pieces, these strips of paper, so that's why I wanted to use them for the inside of the card. I'm going to adhere this panel onto my card base with some Tombow Extreme adhesive. I'm using this just because of the watercolor paper. I want to keep that down flat on my card, and it is a very thick paper. I trimmed off the bottom of this card just because the pink card base was showing through. I added some twine at the top with a little bow just because I thought it needed just a little more interest. To create card number 5, I stamped out a lot of the flowers. I didn't show all of my stamping just to keep this video from being too long. I did want to show this cute cluster of tulips, so I'm stamping that out with some pink gumball ink from Ranger. And the stems I inked up with electric lime. For the darker color, I'm using some MFT ink, and it's called Raspberry. And I just love how these two look together. It's so cute. I'm going to use the coordinating dies to cut out all of my flowers and stems. And then I'm going to jump in to my stamping. And I'm using a piece of the craft cardstock from this kit, as well as some craft cardstock ink. This is going to be a cute tone-on-tone panel. And I use my largest stamps first, just to make sure I have room for them. And then I'm going to fill in this panel with smaller and smaller images. I love this craft cardstock. It's really fun to play with. And now the smaller images are the leaves. And then I also pulled out one of the littlest stamps. I don't know what you would call that, just a bit of the greenery. This just adds a little bit of lightness and airiness to the panel. I think you could just put a sentiment on this panel and call it done. It's so pretty. Glued on all of my die cuts just flat across this panel, as well as the sentiment. I'm using scraps from the craft cardstock panel to decorate the inside. And I had a few bits of flowers left over, so I'm going to add one of the tulip clusters on the inside. This card base is made from the sour apple cardstock. I really like how spring-like and bright this card turned out. And here's a look at the inside. The technique I'm using on card number 6 is stamping with pigment ink right onto dark cardstock. The distress oxides work well for this technique. I'm using my stamp platform just so I can ink it up several times. And then I'm just going to shift the paper around. I'm going to leave the stamp where it is on the door and just move the card panel around. For the second layer, I pull out my acrylic block. It was just easier to do it this way than to try and align it on the door and shift the paper around, like I did with my base layer. So I stamped my largest images first, and now I'm just moving on to some leaves. I'm using 2 different greens for that. This stamp set comes with several different leaf stamps. And then to make it even more bright and airy, I'm using one of the smaller stamps from the set again, and I'm using some white pigment ink just to scatter that around my card panel. I'm using a piece of the pink lemonade cardstock to make my card base, and also a piece of the purple striped paper. I wanted to pop up my main card panel with a bit of craft foam, and I'm just using some score tape to adhere that. I went ahead and die cut my main panel with a scalloped frame die. Now I can pull off the release paper and center this in the middle of my card. I'm using more leftover scraps, extras that I had made to decorate the inside of the card. It's always nice to have extra bits to put away so that when you need to make up a card in a hurry, you have it ready to go. I think these flowers look so pretty on the inside of this card, and I'm just gluing them down flat with more Gina K Connect glue. For the front of the card, I added a few sequins, and that completes number 6. On card number 7, I'm going to use a lot of the cardstocks that came in this kit. I used the dies to cut out the flowers first in these various colors. And then I did the stamping, but I didn't use the base layer stamp because the cardstocks provide a base color for me. I'm using the persimmon cardstock for my card base, and then I used a piece of the pattern paper, the orange dots, to add a little more interest to my card base. I'm stamping my sentiment right onto the craft cardstock. I really love craft cardstock. I didn't know which flowers I wanted to use yet for this card, so I did die cut a lot of them out, and then I'm just going to adhere them onto my card panel. The rose I'm going to pop up with a few foam squares, just to add a little bit of dimension. I cut out way more flowers than I needed for this card, and I thought I was done with just these 3 flowers. I do add one more tulip, and I pop that up with some more foam squares. The top of this card looked like it needed something. It was just a little bit too bare, so I'm adding a few sequins. And for the inside, I thought I'd use up a few of my extra flowers. I have so many, and I'm just putting those down in the corner. And that finishes this card. I'm trying to use every single sentiment that came in this kit. And so my next card is going to be a sympathy card. This one was fast to put together. First, I'm stamping out my sentiment onto a small piece of white cardstock. I'm using some MFT Extreme Black ink to do this. I'm making the card base for another piece of smooth white cardstock, and then I'm just going to adhere down a piece of the pattern paper. I die cut a frame for this sentiment, and I'm going to adhere that right in the center of my card. I want to make this card a little more subdued and elegant because it is a sympathy card. So I'm going to adhere just a few of these die cuts, these stamped out die cuts along the edge of this frame. These vines really look pretty. I really like this stamp. And then I'm going to add a few of the roses and another one of the vines and the roses for the inside of the card. I should have thought of this before I glued down my rose on the inside of the card, but I wanted to add another strip of the pattern paper. So I've just glue a little bit along the edge of it, and then I can just cut off the excess and use that for another project. I found some pretty green sequins from this mix of sequins from Studio Katya, and I'm just going to glue that to the front. Card number 9 is going to be a congratulations card for a wedding. I stamped out the base stamp first with some Angel Pink Memento ink, and then I'm using some Delicata gold ink for the next layer. This is kind of a fun technique. The Delicata gold doesn't show up very well, but if you put some perfect pearls over it, it deepens the color, and it makes it look really shiny. Once you stamp that out, you can buff it off with a clean cloth. The Delicata ink is a pigment ink. It takes longer to dry, so it holds on really well to the Perfect Pearls powder. For the centers of these roses, I'm just using a little bit of MFT's Razzleberry ink. I'm using more Delicata ink on the leaves. I'm rubbing them right into the ink pad. You could also use an ink blending tool to apply the ink, but I only had 3 of them, so I'm just using this method. The reverse tweezers come in handy so you don't get your fingers in the ink. I'll add more of the gold Perfect Pearls on top of these leaves. And then I can just buff off the excess again. I'm going to use a piece of vellum for my card base on this card. This vellum was really difficult to score. It's so thick, it's almost like plastic. And it does end up cracking a little bit on the edge. If you're going to give this card design a try, make sure that you stamp out your sentiment first, especially if you're going to heat emboss it like I am. So I wasn't thinking ahead and I glued everything down. So I'm just putting the whole card base in my mini Misty, and I'm using some Versamark ink. I want the sentiment to be in gold, and so I'm going to pour over some antique gold embossing powder. This would have been a lot easier to heat emboss if I had embossed this before I glued it onto my card base. The vellum cardstock does not like the heat. It bubbles up pretty easily. And this cardstock does end up warping, unfortunately. I'm adding more white cardstock inside my card base just to hide the glue. And then I'm adding even more white cardstock so I have a place to write my sentiment inside this card. And then I end up using just one of the roses in the corner of this card panel. I'm adding a few of these beautiful iridescent bubbles from Studio Katya as a final touch for this card. I just love how these bubbles pick up the pink from the patterned paper beneath it. Card number 10 is going to be a simple card. I wanted to use some of my leftover flowers, and I'm going to use my vase die again. As you can see, I cut out a piece of the Razzleberry cardstock with that. And I'm going to stamp my thank you sentiment. I haven't used this sentiment yet. I'm masking it off so that I can stamp the U under the thank. I was going to cut it out, but the letters were kind of close together and I was afraid of ruining my sentiment stamp. I'm using a little bit of a post-it note to cover up the word thank. And then I can ink up the U, and I'm using some VersaFine Onyx Black ink. And then I can just go ahead and stamp it out. I'm going to pierce a few holes in this panel with my craft pick. I want to be able to tie a ribbon around the vase, and I thought this would be a secure way to do that. I'm pulling out a needle and some baker's twine, and I can sew that into my panel. I haven't used my sewing needles in quite a while, so this was kind of fun to do. Doing embroidery on cards is really popular now, and it looks like a lot of fun. I'm going to have to try that out. I'm going to glue down this vase and the rose before I tie my knot. And I'm just going to make it so the bow will tie perfectly around the top of this cute vase. I'm going to let it dry before I tie my bow. And then that's going to be really easy to tie because it's secured around the back of this card panel. I am going to secure this bow with a micro dot just behind the knot. I don't know how short I want the ends of my bow to be, so I'm just going to leave it for now and make a card base out of the tickled pink cardstock. I'm going to stamp the back of this card base with my Jackie's Craft Table logo. And I'm going to use my corner chompers just on the bottom edges of this card base, just to soften it up a little bit. I used some foam tape to pop up this card panel, and then I can just put it right onto my card base. I think that looks so cute. And now I can trim off the ends of this bow. I'm going to glue on some pretty pink Posh water droplets. I have 2 different sizes of these. It looks opaque now, but the glue will dry clear. I pulled out a white jelly roll pen to add some highlights on this vase. That's it for the front of this card. I like all of the extra little touches on this. On the inside, I'm going to stamp "You're lovely." I love that sentiment. And then I'm going to add even yet another flower. I have so many of these left over. And put that next to the sentiment. I think that looks so pretty. And then this card is complete. Thank you so much for watching. I hope I've given you some good inspiration today, and I hope you get a chance to sit down and create something awesome. Have a wonderful day. Bye.